What's up, everybody? Welcome back once again to Upset Alert. It is episode number 75 of the Ultimate College Football Podcast, celebrating all 130 teams in FBS. And we are officially back up to almost that full number. As I was saying on the last episode on Monday, when we were kind of recapping the week 4 games, we are officially back up to 127 of the 130 eligible teams that will be participating in some way, shape, or form in college football this fall. Some starting later than others, of course. So we've got the Big Ten, the Pac-12, the Mountain West, and the MAC back in the fray. So just a few stragglers that we're missing out on for college football in the fall of 2020. But of course, we got a lot of teams that are already playing and plenty to talk about, as we've got a lot of games on the Saturday slate for tomorrow as I record here on a Friday evening at about 6:30. We've got some games ready to kick off as soon as in about 30 minutes on Friday night here, so I'm going to go ahead and get my predictions out into the world for those two games that are playing tonight, as well as for that full Saturday slate, and we'll kind of preview the entire Week 5 slate here. So let's go ahead and get right into it, and try not to get as long-winded as we did on the last episode, talking about the first week overreactions to the SEC teams. We've got some marquee SEC matchups this weekend, and we'll get into those. But first, let's just start kind of chronological order here. We'll start with the two games that are scheduled for tonight, Friday, October the 2nd. At 7 p.m. tonight, just in a little bit here on the ACC network, we've got FCS Campbell playing at Wake Forest. There's not much to talk about there. Wake Forest is going to win that one pretty comfortably. Campbell has actually played well against a couple of Sun Belt opponents this year, including giving Georgia Southern a run for their money. Took them to the final play of the game to put Campbell away. Campbell put up a few touchdowns on App State as well, but really not much to talk about there. The Demon Deacons are going to win that game pretty comfortably against Campbell, I think. Louisiana Tech at a top 25 team, number 22, BYU. I was interested to see earlier today, BYU is actually a 24-point favorite in this game. That seems a little steep for me. Personally, I think this is a pretty good Louisiana Tech team. This is a team that we've already seen beat one of the conference favorites, at least coming into the season, in Southern Miss. Southern Miss hasn't showed much to this point in the season, but Louisiana Tech has gotten a couple wins. They haven't lost anything yet, so I feel okay about that team as a contender in Conference USA. I do think BYU is the better team. I do think they get the win ultimately tonight, but that 24-point margin seems extremely wide for me against a pretty decent Louisiana Tech team. This is not BYU Navy in week 1 where they're going to come out and just drop 55 points and hold their opponent to a field goal or anything like that. So we're looking at Saturday tomorrow. So October the 3rd. Of note, we do have a couple of postponed games that we'll just mention on here due to COVID-19 exposure, positive tests on various teams. Just a couple of them this week. So it seems they're already doing a better job of kind of cleaning this up early in the season. We had Rice at Marshall. Is going to be postponed to a later date, and Troy at South Alabama. So none of our big marquee matchups or anything like that getting pushed this week. Thankfully, last week, for example, we know we had the Notre Dame Wake Forest game that got postponed. But taking a look here, starting in the noon slot, we've got some SEC football right off the bat. South Carolina at number 3, Florida is a noon game on ESPN this weekend. The Gamecocks didn't look terrible against Tennessee this past weekend. They look decent against what I think is a legitimate, probably at least for now, top 25 rather team in Tennessee. So South Carolina didn't look terrible. But Florida, as we know, put on an offensive show. They showed a lot of fireworks on offense, didn't show much of anything on defense this past weekend against Ole Miss. So I think it's going to be kind of more of the same this weekend. South Carolina might put up a few points in Gainesville down in the swamp of Florida, ultimately probably going to drop another impressive offensive showing against an outmatched South Carolina Gamecocks team. I've got the Gators fairly comfortably in that game. In the noon game on Fox, we have number 9 Texas hosting TCU. Now, Texas pulled it out last week, a very improbable comeback win against Texas Tech, who shockingly was up, I believe, 3 scores on them in the fourth quarter, blew the game in the, I guess you would say, Atlanta Falcons fashion this season. They just found a way to blow the game against the Texas Longhorns late. Texas is a team that has, I guess, impressed to varying degrees to this point in the season. They have at times looked very underwhelming, but at the same time, they haven't lost any games, and that's more than you can say for Oklahoma right now, who previously we probably would have thought of as the favorite in the Big 12. So Texas hosting TCU in this game. TCU's not a bad team. They might be able to keep it pretty close, but I do still like the Longhorns in probably not a particularly sexy win for Texas there either. I think Texas maybe squeaks out another close one, maybe a 1 or 2 score game there, but I ultimately do think they come out with that win over the Horned Frogs. We've got number 21 Tennessee hosting Missouri at noon on the SEC network. In short, I like the Volunteers here. I don't think Missouri is very good this year. We saw them actually overperform, I would say, against Alabama in their game last week, coming back to make it a 19-point game, which certainly was closer than I think most folks would have thought against the Crimson Tide. But regardless, I don't think Missouri is a very good football team. I just don't think the talent level is there. Tennessee, while they didn't look just amazing against South Carolina last week, I think they're going to start finding ways to win. They've been in these close games a lot over the last season and then into this season. They're starting to find ways to win those kind of close games and not lose ones where they need to take care of business. So I like the Volunteers there. Number 24, Pittsburgh, hosting NC State, noon on the ACC network. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one. I like Pitt. That one's not going to be, it's not really going to be anything to call home about, I don't think. I think Pitt wins that one fairly comfortably. They're not going to just run away with it by 4 or 5 touchdowns, but Pitt has looked pretty good to this point in the season for the most part. I think they continue to do that over the Wolfpack. We've got Georgia State hosting East Carolina, a little out-of-conference action for those two teams, a Conference USA Sunbelt matchup, noon on ESPNU. Neither of these teams is good. Let's just call it like it is. They're both pretty bad. East Carolina on the road against Georgia State. I'm going to give a slight edge to East Carolina in that football game. I just don't think very highly of that Georgia State football program at all at the moment. I really don't for East Carolina either. This is one that really you could flip a coin and I could see it going either way. But I just have no confidence in Georgia State right now, so I am going to roll with ECU. We've got Coastal Carolina hosting Arkansas State. This is actually one of the more interesting Sun Belt matchups of the week here. This is noon on ESPN2. It's rare that you see the Sun Belt get one of those ESPN slots, but this is a decent game. These are two undefeated, or excuse me, not two undefeated, but two good teams, we'll say, to this point. Arkansas State, of course, had the big upset win over Kansas State, who then went on to beat Oklahoma, so have fun with the transitive property there. Coastal Carolina also has a Big 12 win, but theirs over Kansas, who, as we know, is pretty bad. Just consistently. So Coastal Carolina and Arkansas State, I do like the hype of it, both being undefeated teams, but let's not kid ourselves here. Arkansas State, coming into the season, we would have said this, and I'm going to continue to say it now, is a much better team than Coastal Carolina. Coastal Carolina doesn't truly belong on the same field with them, so I am rolling with the Red Wolves. Noon at ABC, we've got West Virginia hosting Baylor. This another interesting point spread I thought that I was actually looking at earlier today. Baylor favored by just 2.5 points in this game on the road against West Virginia. West Virginia has not looked bad to this point in the season, but I do not think they are even on the same level as a team like Baylor. I understand that Baylor lost a lot in the past season. I really do understand that. But at the same time, this is a Baylor team that went to the Sugar Bowl last year. This is a team that only lost in the regular season to Oklahoma, and then again came close against Oklahoma in that Big 12 championship game. So their only losses all season were to Oklahoma and Georgia. You can't fault them too much for that. Last year, I understand, again, they've lost some talent. They lost their head coach to the NFL. But this is still a pretty darn good Baylor football team, I think. And going on the road against West Virginia, that certainly seems like a game they should win by more than a field goal to me. So I am rolling with Baylor, even giving up the points there. Baylor should win that one fairly comfortably, I think. I would say at least 1 to 2 touchdowns, probably leaning more toward that 10 to 14 point range. UTSA at UAB. Interestingly enough, UTSA is the one who's coming into this game undefeated. UTSA, not a team that I was high on at any point whatsoever during the offseason, the preseason, even now, really. They've got a great mascot, is about the best thing I can say about UTSA's football program. The Roadrunners at the Blazers at 12:30. UAB is still my pick to win Conference USA. I understand that they look pretty underwhelming at times early on in the season, and of course they played against Miami, which now looks like a better and better loss every day because Miami is now a legit, I think you would say at least top 15 team based on the way they have played to this point. Top 10 in some of the polls already are the Miami Hurricanes, so you can't fault UAB for losing that one by a couple scores. I like UAB to beat UTSA fairly comfortably in this game at 12:30. This one looks like it does not have a TV slot. I don't think it's going to be fit for TV, quite frankly. UTSA, I understand, is 3-0 to this point in the season, but they've got a 2-point win over Middle Tennessee, who's been awful on their resume as one of their highlight wins. I like UAB to win by 3 or 4 touchdowns here. We've got Liberty hosting North Alabama. Not much to say here. I won't waste your time. 1 p.m. on ESPN3, so streaming only. Liberty's going to win this one. Liberty beat Western Kentucky, of course, was their big highlight win thus far. They're playing an FCS team. The Flames roll here. 1:30 on CBS Sports Network. We've got Army hosting Abilene Christian. Same story here. Army is a legitimately good football team. Maybe not quite a top 25 team, but they're close there. And Abilene Christian is an FCS opponent. They're way outmatched here. Army rolls in that one. We've got one of our biggest games of the day right here. A top 15 matchup. Number 2, Alabama hosting number 13, Texas A&M. This is the 3:30 SEC on CBS game this week. So kind of deemed to be the biggest matchup there, I guess. I will give credit where credit's due. Last week, I really questioned the game that they chose for CBS because that's supposed to be the biggest game of the week. Last week, they chose LSU hosting Mississippi State, and I was thinking they were crazy because I was like, that's not going to be a good game. I was thinking Kentucky and Auburn, maybe a much better game last week. I was wrong. I was very wrong on that. LSU and Mississippi State turned out to be by far, I think, the most interesting game in the SEC last weekend. So maybe they're onto something here, but quite frankly, I don't think so. If you guys have been listening to the podcast for a while, you know I'm not particularly high on this Texas A&M team. I don't think they're worthy of that number 13 next to their name. I think they're going 5-5 in the SEC all conference schedule this year. If you look back since Texas A&M has joined the SEC, they've gone about 500 or slightly better in every year of conference play. The best year that they had, of course, you look back at Johnny Football and his time at Texas A&M. Of course, they had the one standout year. They beat Alabama, actually, in Bryant-Denny Stadium with Johnny Manziel this year. Kellen Mond is not Johnny Manziel. I am beginning to lose faith that Jimbo Fisher is a good football coach. You say a lot about the guy, but normally I would argue you can't argue the fact that he's a good football coach. I'm starting to lose a little faith in that even. This football team has arguably underperformed in every year since he's taken over at Texas A&M. This is supposed to be their year where he's had enough time, right? He's had enough time to get some of his guys into the program and to coach up those guys that were already there. Against Alabama, I don't see it happening. I believe it was about an 18-point spread here. I don't even think Texas A&M covers. I think Alabama wins this one very comfortably. I think it might even be a wider margin than they had against Missouri last week. I think this is probably a 3-touchdown or more win for the Crimson Tide. We've got number 12, North Carolina on the road at Boston College on ABC at 3:30. Boston College actually has had some up and down moments, right? They had the 26-6 win over Duke. I would say was a bit of a highlight, maybe unexpected, that they pull out the 20-point win there, and then it took them a 24-point comeback to beat Texas State. So this Boston College team is very up and down, very hot and cold. North Carolina, I think, is going to be a consistent force, not at the top of the ACC, but just below that top tier. I think they are a legit top 25, top 20, maybe even team. The number 12 is a little high. We'll see that go down when the Big Ten and Pac-12 teams start joining in the party here. But I like the Tar Heels pretty comfortably over Boston College in that game. We've got number 15 Cincinnati hosting South Florida. This is on ESPN Plus at 3:30. This one, not much to say here. Cincinnati is a legit top 15 team. They and UCF are the teams to beat in the American Athletic Conference this year. South Florida is arguably the worst team in that conference. So Cincinnati is going to roll big time in that one. We've got Kansas. Kansas. I went back and forth all offseason about whether I thought Kansas would be improved at all. They have shown me, why would you ever have any kind of faith in Kansas at all? Les Miles is a bad football coach at this point in his career. Kansas is a horrible football team, just in terms of the overall level of talent. They are hosting number 17 Oklahoma State at 3:30 on ESPN. Oklahoma State's offense has underperformed to this point in the season. I think this is their coming out party. Oklahoma State is going to run all over this Kansas Jayhawks defense with Chuba Hubbard, one of the best running backs in the country. I think he goes for close to 200 yards in this game, scores a few touchdowns. I think OK State uses this game to kind of springboard into the rest of their Big 12 schedule, because they've shown, I mean, with the Oklahoma loss, with the losses to Sunbelt teams, of course, the Sunbelt a few weeks ago going 3-0 against the Big 12. I think the Big 12 has shown it's pretty much wide open. Texas nearly losing to Texas Tech this past week. Oklahoma State kind of underperforming to this point. I think it's wide open in the Big 12, and if OK State wants it, it is there for the taking. So I like this game to kind of start their candidacy as a legitimate contender. So I would like for their offense to show me something in this game if they are a legitimate Big 12 championship contender. 3:30 on ESPN2, we've got SMU hosting number 25 Memphis. This is the biggest game in the American Athletic Conference this week. These are two legitimate conference championship contenders. SMU last week had their most complete performance yet to this point in the season. Memphis has had a lot of games get postponed because of COVID-19, so it will be interesting to see if they come into this game a little rusty, having not played as many games as SMU at this point in the season. I do think Memphis is the better team here, though, and I do think they ultimately come out with the win. Should be a good game, though. Like I said, there is the factor of Memphis being probably the better team on paper, but SMU maybe having a little more time to prepare, having played some more real football to this point than the Memphis Tigers. But I do like Memphis in that game. I think ultimately it will come down to those games between Memphis, UCF, and Cincinnati. When those three teams play each other this year, those will be the games that determine the American Athletic Conference championship. We've got Texas Tech at Kansas State, 3:30 on Fox Sports 1. It's hard to say what Kansas State is. They lost to Arkansas State, and yet they beat Oklahoma in the following week. Texas Tech gave Texas a run for their money last week. So this one could be a little closer than it should be on paper, but I am still rolling with my gut on this one, and that's the Kansas State Wildcats by a couple of touchdowns. 4 p.m. ESPNU, we've got Florida Atlantic and Charlotte. Not a ton to say here. I don't think Charlotte's a particularly great team. They had a decent game against App State. App State has looked worse and worse since that game. So I think that was kind of more of a statement on how much of a step back App State has taken, more so than Charlotte taking any big step forward or anything like that. I like Florida Atlantic's offense to be explosive, to score some points on this Charlotte defense, and ultimately to come out with the win for the Owls down in Boca Raton. We've got Duke hosting Virginia Tech, 4 p.m. ACC Network. This is one we won't spend a ton of time on. Virginia Tech looks pretty solid so far. Duke, not so much. Hokies roll in that one. Ole Miss at Kentucky, 4 p.m. SEC Network. Both of these teams lost last week, so something's got to give. Kentucky, of course, lost to a top 10 team in Auburn. Ole Miss lost to a top 10 team in Florida. This Ole Miss offense did show out a little bit against Florida, so will be interesting to see how they match up against Kentucky. Maybe kind of Ole Miss's offense versus Kentucky, how they perform, gives us an early indicator of if Florida's defense was just that bad against Ole Miss, or if Ole Miss just has a crazy good offense that they put up 35 points on a top 5 team. I do give the edge to Kentucky in this game, though. I like the Kentucky offense. I like the way that they run things up there. Kavasier Smoke, one of the best names in all of college football, is a heck of a running back. They've got a great defensive line, a good offensive line. I just think they're a team that doesn't tend to beat themselves. Ole Miss is the sexier team, you have to say, with Lane Kiffin, who just is always going to be in the headlines there as the head coach. Kind of that high-flying trick play type offense. I do think Ole Miss will score some points in that game, but I like Kentucky. I like Kentucky in this football game, in a close one probably. Florida State hosting Jacksonville State. I had some folks on Twitter that I saw over the past week post the rest of Florida State's schedule after they got absolutely annihilated by Miami in primetime on ABC this past weekend, and they said, is Florida State going to go winless in 2020? And honestly, this is the only game that makes me feel comfortable saying no. Florida State has looked so awful to this point in the season. Somehow, if you can even fathom it, I think they've actually looked worse than they did under Willie Taggart the last couple of years. That loss to Georgia Tech in their first game of the season is looking pitiful now after we've seen Georgia Tech go on to lose by multiple scores to Syracuse, after we saw them lose by 4 touchdowns to UCF. This Florida State team might legitimately, other than South Florida, I'm still going to say they're better than South Florida, but other than that, I think this is the worst Division I football team in the state of Florida. UCF is miles better. Florida is miles better. Miami, as they showed last week when they beat up on them, is miles better. I guess you can throw Florida International ahead of Florida State still, but not by much. Honestly, this team has looked really, really bad. It's the same old problems that have plagued them the last couple of years. Their offensive line is just awful. It's hard to watch. They've got skill players. They've got players at those skill positions, receivers and running backs that have been highly recruited. So in theory, they are talented, but they don't get a chance to do anything because they're getting hit in the backfield every single play just about. Florida State will win against Jacksonville State this week, but man, you cannot feel good about the state of your football program if you are a Florida State Seminole fan. Hopefully, 4 p.m. on ESPN3, Seminoles fans, you get a little taste of victory, because I don't think you're going to get too many of them this year. We've got Middle Tennessee, speaking of a team who's not going to see much victory this year, hosting Western Kentucky, who has also underperformed. This is 5 p.m. on ESPN3. Honestly, this is going to be an ugly game. Middle Tennessee has looked awful this year. Western Kentucky, a team that I was fairly high on in the preseason, has also looked awful to this point in the season. I do still think Western Kentucky has the talent edge here, so I'm giving the edge to Western Kentucky. Give me the Hilltoppers in a fairly ugly, but maybe not necessarily that close game. I think they win by probably a couple of scores, at least on the Blue Raiders. Two great mascots, by the way. We've got Navy at Air Force, 6 p.m. on CBS Sports Network. Interestingly enough, the Air Force, who's technically part of the Mountain West Conference, was already scheduled to play against Navy and Army before the Mountain West announced that they were officially doing football. They were at least going to do what they call the Commander-in-Chief Cup, where the three major service academies that are in the FBS all play each other. Navy, after that awful performance against BYU in their first game, has continued to improve, I would say. In the preseason, I picked Air Force to win that Commander-in-Chief Cup, to beat Navy and Army this year, and I'm still going to ride with that, even though this is Air Force's first game of the season, so you may see some of that rust that you saw with Navy in their first game of the season. I do like the Air Force Academy here. I think they're just overall the better team than Navy, despite maybe a little bit of rust coming into this football game. We've got UL Monroe hosting Georgia Southern, 7 p.m. on ESPN+. Where do we begin? UL Monroe, it's not been a good start. It's not been a good start, to say the least. If you follow us on Twitter, at Upset Alert Pod, you have seen our updated rankings probably coming into this week, and you know that despite what I said all offseason, I was tooting the horn of UTEP is the worst team in college football. Guess what? UTEP has 3 wins already. UL Monroe has 0, and they have looked really bad on their way to a winless season so far. They are ranked 127 out of 127 teams that are currently on track to participate in college football this fall on our rankings. Again, that is subjective. But this team has not given any inspiration of hope at all. Georgia Southern has not been particularly great, but hey, they had a decent performance against a good team in the Louisiana Ragin' Cajuns. So I am rolling with Georgia Southern. Hail Southern. They are picking up a comfortable win over Louisiana Monroe in that game, 7 p.m. ESPN+. And now we've got the game of the week. Number 7, Auburn at number 4, Georgia. 7:30 ESPN. College Game Day will be in town. I have a few thoughts here. And I will preface this, as always, by saying those of you who have been listening to the podcast for a while, know that I am a Georgia Bulldog. I went to the University of Georgia. I try to check my bias when I'm making predictions, so just keep that in mind. There's 2 ways to think about Georgia. It's the first half of that Arkansas game, which is it was inexplicably bad, right? The offense, that was as bad of a half offensively as I have ever seen in my time as a Georgia Bulldog fan. The second half, they pulled it together, and I would argue to say that Stetson Bennett, much to my surprise, and I'm sure the surprise of many, looked surprisingly Jake Fromm-like in that second half. He was not out there slinging the rock 40 or 50 yards down the field. He was not scrambling for 25, 30 yards at a time, but he was finding people and hitting them in stride for completions. He was accurate as a passer. He did pass it a little bit downfield. He did move around a little in the pocket, but ultimately he didn't turn the ball over and he moved it down the field. And that is all Georgia really needs to do, I think, to at least get their way to something like an 8 or 9 win season in this 10 game schedule, rather. Now, they've got a brutal stretch coming up here, starting with this Auburn game. They've got Auburn, Tennessee, Alabama, Kentucky, and Florida all in a row. This Auburn game kind of kicks that off, so you have to start that on the right tone. Let's start outside of saying that this Georgia team vastly underperformed on offense in the first half of that Arkansas game and then recovered nicely in the second half. Let's start with the facts. Georgia, over the last decade or more, has owned Auburn for the most part, especially in Athens. I understand the home field advantage is maybe not quite what it has been in the past this year due to restrictions on attendance. But that just kind of is, that's one of those things that kind of is what it is to me. And I'm not overwhelmingly impressed by this Auburn offense. I am overwhelmingly impressed by this Georgia defense. I do think Georgia wins that matchup. I think that the defense will successfully hold Auburn to just, I would say, a max of 2 touchdowns, maybe a field goal or 2 mixed in there as well. Probably more likely, I would say, 1 touchdown with a couple of field goals, unless the Georgia offense just keeps punting and punting and punting, which is possible. It's very possible. I'll acknowledge that. But I do think this Georgia offense will be able, based on the second half performance of Stetson Bennett, you combine that with the fact they've got JT Daniels healthy, who, don't forget, is a former 5-star quarterback who transferred over from USC, who we have not seen yet in a Georgia uniform. Only probably Kirby Smart really knows what the quarterback situation is going to look like for Georgia tomorrow at 7:30. But I think it is competent enough, and I think they make maybe more of a choice, as they did in the second half of that Arkansas game, to commit to the run, running between the tackles with a guy like Zamir White, and maybe just sticking to the screens and toss plays for James Cook, who could not find anything between the tackles. I think that the Georgia offense gets enough, and I think their defense pitches close to a perfect game. I think Georgia wins this one against Auburn. Again, take it with a grain of salt. I recognize that. I am a Georgia Bulldog picking this game, but I think there's a reason. A wise man once said, trust the people in Vegas because they have to put their money where their mouth is. Georgia is a 7-point favorite in this game. That is higher than I would say I would pick this game. I wouldn't feel comfortable laying money down on Georgia winning by more than a touchdown in this game. I think it could be very close, as it was last year, as it has been many times. But ultimately, push comes to shove. I like this Georgia defense to make some big plays. I like this Georgia offense to score just enough to beat Auburn in this big primetime ESPN matchup. We'll move on from there. Number 11, UCF hosting Tulsa. 7:30 ESPN2. Not much to say here. Tulsa is bad. UCF is great. UCF is going to roll by several points here. Number 16, Mississippi State hosting Arkansas. 7:30 on the SEC Network alternate. Mississippi State, of course, just upset LSU last week. Everybody is head over heels in love with this team now. Regardless of how much you are in love with this team, or maybe not in love with this team, not quite convinced yet, Mississippi State is going to comfortably beat Arkansas because they are not a good football team. Let's leave it at that. Bulldogs win. 7:30 ABC, Iowa State hosting number 18 now, Oklahoma. That feels weird, seeing a number that high next to Oklahoma. Oklahoma, of course, is coming off a bad upset loss against Kansas State. Preseason, I changed my pick. I had originally, in our original picks, I picked Kansas State to beat Oklahoma. And because of the schedule changes, and I said, no, Kansas State's going to be their first Big 12 game of the year, I changed my mind and said, you know what? It's going to be Iowa State the week after that who upsets them. I am not 100% sure that Iowa State isn't going to win this game, especially after the way Oklahoma, and particularly quarterback Spencer Rattler, looked, for lack of a better word, rattled at times, throwing 3 picks in that game. I'm not 100% convinced that Iowa State isn't going to win this game, but I am going to flake on my original pick for a second week in a row. Now that Oklahoma has lost to Kansas State, I'm giving it to Iowa State in this, I'm giving it to Oklahoma over Iowa State in this one. I think the Sooners bounce back. I can't fathom them losing multiple regular season games. It's a possibility, though. It's a very distinct possibility, because even if you get by Iowa State this week, this team's still going to have to play OK State and Texas later on in the season, not to mention Baylor, who's a good team as well. So watch out, Sooners fans. I think the Big 12 might have already played themselves out of the college football playoff, but I like Oklahoma to win this game. Number 20, LSU at Vanderbilt, 7:30 on the SEC Network. Not much to say here. LSU lost a very disappointing game against Mississippi State last week. They will bounce back this week. Vanderbilt is bad. Don't let that performance against Texas A&M make you think Vanderbilt is good. A&M just isn't as good as we think they are. LSU wins comfortably in Nashville. Southern Miss, who has looked absolutely horrible to this point in the season, at North Texas, 7:30. It's not on TV. I told you last week, fool me once, fool me twice about Southern Miss. I hopped off the Southern Miss bandwagon. I don't see them making that Conference USA championship game anymore based on the way they played, but I think they're going to beat North Texas this week. I think it'll happen. We've got the University of Virginia at number 1 Clemson, 8 p.m. on the ACC network. It's weird with the Pac-12 not playing. Last week we had BYU after dark. But it's weird with the Pac-12 not playing that 8 p.m. is the latest kickoff of the night. Virginia at Clemson, not a ton to say here. This is not the same Virginia team that went to the ACC championship game last year. Even then, they were not on Clemson's level, truly. But even so, this is not the same Virginia team from last year. They are not even in the same league. Clemson is going to win this one by a whole lot. They're going to keep tuning up, essentially, for the Notre Dame game, which will be their only real challenge probably all season. And that's about going to wrap us up for our Week 5 predictions, for our Week 5 preview here on Upset Alert episode 75. For those of you who are listening to us on Apple Music, or Apple Podcasts, I suppose, please do subscribe to us on there. If you have the chance, please do take the time to leave us that 5-star review as well. Helps us greatly to get more eyeballs and more ears on the podcast. If you're listening on Spotify, please do follow us, like us on there, and do the same. We're also on pretty much every podcast service, so Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, whatever your podcast service of choice is, please do subscribe, like us, whatever it is on your service of choice. If you want to follow us on Twitter, it's at Upset Alert Pod on Twitter. It's been on the screen pretty much the whole time, so hopefully you've gotten it by now. But at Upset Alert Pod on Twitter, if you want to give us a follow on there, that's where we post when we're going live, recording the podcast here on twitch.tv/robotbraineater. I know it's a lot of URLs to keep up with. But that's where we post when we're going live on Twitch to record the podcast, when it's live on podcast services, as well as just sharing all the news of the college football world, both during the games, updates, and beyond throughout the week. So again, just want to thank you guys so much for listening to episode number 75. We are here normally every Monday and Thursday. Today's episode coming a little bit later than normal, but we will be back here on Monday as regularly scheduled. We'll be wrapping up all of the big storylines from week 5, this big weekend of college football. Thank you guys so much once again for listening. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. And until Monday, we will see you later.